Hi, everyone. Thank you all for tuning in today. I hope everyone in the Northeast is warm inside preparing for the snow. For those of you who don't know, ISAW, the Institute for the Study of the Ancient World, is a graduate school and research institute of NYU located in the Upper East Side by the Metropolitan Museum of Art and NYU's Institute of Fine Arts. We are also very proud to have our exhibition program, which brings everyone here today. We usually put on about 1 to 2 exhibitions a year that are regularly covered by the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Hyperallergic, and more. So come check us out next time. We are all able to be together in person again, whenever that will be. As the most visual and public part of ISAW, our exhibitions play a crucial role in furthering ISAW's mission to foster interest in and understanding of the interconnected civilizations of antiquity. With this in mind, our fall 2018 exhibition, Devotion and Decadence, the Berthouville Treasure, and Roman Luxury from the Bibliothèque Nationale de France, provides an exceptional opportunity to explore the significance of Roman luxury arts and its role in different devotional and cultural settings. Though I leave the full explanation to my colleague Claire Fitzgerald, the Associate Director for Exhibitions and Gallery Curator at ISAW. Claire came to ISAW with a background in both curatorship and education. She holds a PhD in art history from Emory University. As an Egyptologist, she has a particular interest in the definition of space through image and identity in funerary culture. She has held a number of fellowships, including at the American Research Center in Egypt and the Metropolitan Museum of Art. She has curated exhibitions and permanent installations on a wide array of topics and collections, both ancient and modern, and teaches museum methodology and practice at ISAW. So without further ado, I will hand it over to Claire as she takes us into the galleries.
Thank you so much, Iris and Michelle, for organizing this, and thank you for joining us here today to talk about one of my favorite exhibitions that we've done at ISAW. This exhibition was the result of collaboration between the Getty Museum and the Bibliothèque Nationale de France, which houses the Cabinet Médaille, which I'll reference a little bit later. Having this material in our galleries was really a highlight for me. Some of the objects in this exhibition, this cup actually in particular, I would go and visit every day in the gallery. So I knew that it was a huge honor to have this material in our galleries, and I do miss it. We at ISAW, each institution brings their own sort of interests and flavor to the material that they exhibit, and so at ISAW we really wanted to focus on not only the fact that the material that you'll see today is extremely beautiful and luxurious, but also that it comes from a context, which I'll explain in a moment, which speaks to devotion, religious devotion. And so we wanted to sort of highlight both of those things in our exhibition. And just as an aside, when you're working on an exhibition, one of the things that can be difficult is trying to think of a title. And we chose Devotion and Decadence, but this material also was shown at the Nie Carlsberg Glyptothek in Copenhagen, and I went to see it there. And the English translation of the title for that exhibition was High on Luxury. But my uncle, who has lived in Denmark for a long time, told me that the Danish title actually translated to something closer to drunk and rich, which I love. So there's this really there's that element to this. There's also an element that relates to religious devotion and trade, and all of these different things come, and the marriage of different cultures, and all of that stuff sort of feeds into these objects. So I hope I can give you a sense of them today, and it's fun for us to revisit them. So we here at ISAW, this is our building. We are on 84th Street, on East 84th Street, and we tend to bring material from all throughout the world to again look at it in a way that focuses on both cross-disciplinary approaches to the ancient world, as well as sort of showing the ancient world as an interconnected place. So sometimes when people are introduced to the ancient world, we kind of sometimes act as though um, you know, Rome was here, Greece was here, Egypt was here, and these places aren't really interconnected when, of course, they are, and much more broadly when we talk about the Silk Roads, when we talk about, throughout the world. So this is sort of what we look at. We hope we can welcome you to the galleries soon. This is what you find when you enter. So this was how the galleries looked when we did the exhibition. There are two rooms, so we divided the material sort of to relate to two different sort of themes, broadly speaking themes that we approached, and I'll touch on both of those today. So this story begins in the modern sense in a place called Berthouville, or a little town actually very close to Berthouville. And so you see that here, sort of near where the Seine meets the English Channel. Um, what happened here was on March 21st in 1830, a man named, if you can believe it, Prosper Torrin was plowing in a field which he had recently acquired. And while he's doing so, he hits on a tile um, and pulls back the tile. And under that, he finds a treasure of about two sculptures, 60 vessels, all dating to the Roman period. So I'll talk a little bit about what time periods these objects come from in a moment. But basically, the material had not seen the light of day in 1,500 years. So Prosper was, of course, overwhelmed by this discovery, but due to sort of local superstitions about treasure and what happens to people who find treasures, that bad luck comes from these sorts of things, he chose not to touch it. He sort of used a hoe and a pick to scoop the objects into a bag. Now, so this is a little bit of sort of a fanciful recreation of, you can see Prosper there, and you can see him actually holding, one of the cups that I referenced in the first image. So this is what he found. This is, again, an incredible wealth of material. It's about 55 pounds of silver. And you can see that many of these are vessels, extremely high quality vessels, some sculptures, and we'll talk through those in a minute. But confronted with this material, Prosper had to decide what to do with it. And like many treasures, or we believe many treasures that were found, the first idea is to melt it for its material. So Prosper was planning to, take this silver and have it melted down, and this would be a huge, windfall for him. So at this point, this amount of silver would have probably fetched about 6,000 francs. So he's bringing it to town to sort of go follow through with this, and a family member says, "Oh, you should talk to this local antiquarian about this first." Prosper does, thankfully, very thankfully for us, and that scholar then alerts colleagues in Paris, who immediately, of course, recognize the incredible value and rarity of this from a historical standpoint. And the Louvre and the Cabinet Médaille, which is the cabinet of the sort of the house, the collection of royal medals, which ultimately becomes part of the National Library, the Bibliothèque Nationale. These two institutions enter into a bidding war for this material. So the Louvre ultimately offers 14,500 francs, and the Cabinet Médaille offers 15,000, and so the Cabinet Médaille wins. Interestingly, the curator or the individual who was bidding for the Cabinet Médaille uh, sort of bid more than he was necessarily allowed to, and so he ended up sort of there being some pretty severe career repercussions for him. But as a result, regardless of how, as a result, this material ended up in in the collection of the Cabinet Médaille, part of the Bibliothèque Nationale, and that is where it remains today. Um, so, what had Prosper hit on? Where was where was this material coming from? The answer you can see here. What we see here is an aerial view of the field near Berthouville, and here we see electrical resistivity images, which show us sort of what that there was a sanctuary and a theater, a Roman sanctuary and a Roman theater, which existed here. Um, the the material that Prosper found came from this area, and what this was a Gallo-Roman fanum. A fanum is a type of shrine with a theater that reflected both local Gallic religious traditions and Roman religious traditions. Um, this site was meant to sort of incorporate ritual that drew on both traditions. So this sort of comes to this is an important point because, of course, so often when we talk about sort of cultural influence, we talk about it as sort of emanating out from one point. So Rome is the center of, sort of culture. And then as we move further out into the provinces, that sort of becomes diluted. Now, that is not actually the case. What happens is that new interactions are occurring that create something new. So we shouldn't look at material that is produced elsewhere further away from Rome as somehow lesser than, when in fact it's a different production, and a lot of it certainly is certainly as magnificent as that which was made in the center. So we always have to be kind of aware that that construct of thinking of center and periphery may diminish the way we look at objects that come from other places. And I think that this material certainly argues against that idea. So what we find here is, and actually I'm just going to go back for 1 second. What the type of material that we see here, we could divide in a couple different ways, but there are two sort of general groups of material. There's one group which dates to the 1st century and was possibly made in Rome, probably made in Rome, and probably had a life as elite tableware, elite material that later after that was dedicated at the temple. Then there's a second group of material, which probably most of which dates to the 2nd and 3rd century, which is of local manufacture, and more of that was probably made specifically for dedication at the temple. So one of the parts of ritual at a fanum like this was to offer to the god, in this case the god Mercury, who's the god of commerce, money, trade, and oftentimes, of course, you would offer to the god after having received some sort of boon from him. So you would ask for, a successful voyage, and when you successfully returned, you would have to keep up your end of the bargain and make your offering to the god. So what we see in the Berthouville cache is probably material that was dedicated to Mercury at this temple site. So here is sort of one of the stars of the show, and this is the god Mercury. This is a very large sculpture. It's actually the largest of its type that remains today. So it's about 22 inches tall, and It dates to the 2nd or 3rd century. It was likely made somewhere in the Gallic in Gaul. So just to step back for a moment, I should have mentioned. So Gaul comes under Roman control in 52 BC, and the length, and then Rome sort of remains, you know, sort of nominally in charge of Gaul for several centuries. So what's happening here is that local Celtic tradition is marrying with Roman influence. And so here we see a Roman god, Mercury, um, being worshipped in an environment which again is sort of a hybrid. Um, he is he is made with a technique called repoussé, meaning that the silver in flat pieces of silver are molded and then worked from the inside and chased from the outside in order to create the form. So you can see his musculature is very insistent, very evident. He has that sort of Grecian lean where he's leaning more on one foot, and outstretched in his hand is outstretched. He would have held in that a bag of money. That was one of his attributes. And then, of course, in his other hand, you can see his snaky staff, which is called the caduceus, and that's another one of his attributes. So he has a lot of things which highlight the fact that he is Mercury. Um, I'm going to move on to some details of him. So what you can see here is the back of Mercury. You can see that his head, he's hollow. So his head would have had a little pedicis, a little cap on it, a winged cap probably, and that's now lost. So that's why he has that little hole up there. And I give you this image not just to focus on his tush, but to highlight the fact that you can see here how this piece was made. So these 6 pieces of silver were joined in order to create the volume of the body. And here you can see these sawtooth joins, which is where the silver was joined along the back of his leg. So one of the reasons that Mercury is an important deity outside in this particular place is that this is a place where trade routes meet. So we have the Seine, and then the crossing to the crossing of the English Channel. So we have here this place where commerce is extremely important, and as well as that there's is a place where there's cultural cultural interaction. So this was a totally appropriate place to have a shrine to the god Mercury. If we move on, we're going to look at a couple other objects which are also found in the cache, which very much speak to the cross-cultural nature of this site and therefore the objects which are dedicated there. What we see here is this is a sort of little handled cup. And this would probably have been something that would have been made locally in order to be dedicated at the shrine. Why do I say that? First, we see the iconography on it is somewhat specific. So the figure that we see here on the edge of the handle is Maya or Rosmerta. So who are Maya and Rosmerta? So Mercury is, the male deity. His consort in Roman mythology is Maya. However, when we see him represented in Gaul and other Celtic areas, we also see the local Celtic goddess Rosmerta represented. She is a goddess who's a little bit more difficult for us to pin down because of the lack of indigenous texts about her. But what we see here is kind of the conflation of a local goddess and a Roman goddess, and the god that therefore the goddess represented sort of takes on the power of both of them and the meaning of both of them. So that also is really important when you are creating a religious center in a province, because you're drawing on indigenous culture and religion and marrying it with that of your own. And so that makes it all the more powerful. But we believe that this piece would have been made for dedication. Also, this type of handled cup is often used for pouring libations as part of religious ritual. So that makes it appropriate. But what you can see here, which is interesting, is this punched, this is what donor inscription. So this is what a donor inscription looks like. And we have the punched lettering which records the name of the donor. It says to Augustin Mercury, which again is just a version of Mercury, the Roman version of Mercury, but we don't have to get into that. Germanissa, daughter of Iscarus, fulfilled her vow willingly as merited. So what this tells us is not only that women were doing dedicating at this site, and pretty high status things, but also that not local women were, because Germanissa is a Gallic name, as is her father's name. So we see one more piece, which is also dedicated by Germanissa. And again, you can see again, were these things dedicated at the same time? Were they dedicated at different festivals over a couple years? It's not really clear to us. But what we see here are things that certainly were locally made. And this piece, probably it's a plate. This piece probably had a lived life, probably was a plate in their household that was valuable because of its artistry and its material, and then was dedicated at the sanctuary. So now we move on to sort of the big guns. These are pieces that were dedicated by one donor. He was a Roman citizen. And just a quick look at these can tell us that these pieces, many of these pieces, with the exception of this little handled spoon, most of these are traditionally thought to have come from Rome. And by that, I mean in Italy. The reason for that is in part goes back to that idea which I presented earlier, which is that really nice things only come from the center and then go out to the periphery. That's part of it, but also it's because the parallels that we have for this material from other excavated contexts come from Rome, particularly Pompeii and Herculaneum. So I'll get into that in a minute. But what I would just want to start with is to say just the incredible beauty of these pieces. And these two pieces, these two large skiffoi, and I don't know if you can tell based on because we're on Zoom, but these are very large. They are very large drinking cups for wine, communal drinking of wine, and I'll get into that in a minute. But you can just see that these have extremely elaborate workmanship, but also extremely elaborate iconography. And I'll talk about why that's important in a moment. But just to give you a sense of sort of what Prosper must have, I mean, it must have been incredible, you know. So this is one of my favorite pieces. It's the piece that I went down and looked at every day. This is a skiffoi. A skiffoi is a cup in this form. It can be made in any material, but with these little handles, and you slip your fingers through those rings and it allows you to drink. They're wine cups typically, but this is something else. It's made in repoussé. So again, basically there's a band of silver which is worked from behind and chased on the front, so you can see little areas of gilding that accent the piece. And what we have on each, so there are two skiffoi, they're a pair, but they have different iconography on them. On each of them is an old centaur and a young centaur, a male centaur and a female centaur, and a happy centaur and a sad centaur. So again, on each cup, there are figures. And in addition to the centaurs, there are these little cupids that are running around being naughty and doing all sorts of things that I'll get into in a minute. Now, this iconography is associated with Dionysus, the god of wine. So these pieces would have been, this is the luxury. This is where we come with the decadence. These pieces would have been part of an elite Roman household. Feasting was a very important part of establishing and maintaining your social status in the Roman world, whether it was in the provinces or in the center. And having objects like this and feasting and showing them off was important on two different levels. It not only showed that you were wealthy and that you were someone of taste, um, but also the iconography on these pieces were meant to allow you and your guests to show off how smart you were, your erudition. You wanted to be, because the fact that you had an old and a young centaur, a happy, sad centaur, male, female, those sort of those parallels allowed your guests to declaim on, either great authors who wrote on these topics, or the human condition, or all these things. So this just opens up worlds for you and your guests to talk about. And being a good guest, an intelligent guest, a charming guest was very much part of your social cachet. um, so just to go through some of the details here, it's extremely dense. We have mythological references, but one of the things that I love is that this was a cup which had been used for wine. And honestly, to pick this up toward your face, you would have been identifying new details as you did that. This is an intimate object. It's something that you bring to your face. Um, but also it's a vessel, right? And we have all of this representations of other luxury vessels. So it's sort of this self-referential little game. You're drinking a vessel with vessels on it, like the vessel that you have, and like the other vessels that are on the table. And, kind of you're experiencing the effects of the wine as the Dionysiac creatures are. And that's sort of part of the fun and the play of it. But just to zero in a little bit, this is the other side of that cup. So we noticed a female centaur on the other side. Here we have a male centaur. I'm going to zoom in on him a little bit, but just to give you an example of some of the things that are going on, we have this Cupid trying to catch a peacock. You have this Cupid being naughty and kind of dumping over a vessel. But let's zoom in even a little bit more. So here, what you're seeing here, which is kind of probably drawing your eye, is an old repair. Oftentimes, this material was repaired with wax. So this is an old discolored wax, which I'll get it. I can talk to it in a minute, but I want you to focus on the figure. So what we see here is a male centaur, and he's puffed his cheeks out because what's missing is a flute that he would have been holding. Okay, so we have this beautiful, just sort of his cheeks puffed out there. Behind him is a paniska, which is a half goat, half lady, half person figure, again, a creature associated with Bacchus and Dionysus. And she's expressing breast milk into a little bowl. And the implication is that this little Cupid is feeding a little dragon, a little snaky winged sea creature that's wrapped around his arm with that paniska milk. So what does a little dragon eat? Apparently paniska milk. So these are sort of playful, unexpected little details that that guests would engage with to share stories over. And we can imagine how stories about how luxurious and wonderful someone's dinner party was a real part of your social power. Um, one other piece that is part of Domitius Tutus's dedication is this beautiful bowl. So this is a bowl, we're looking down into it right now, and this is a philae, which would have been used again as it can either be used as a drinking vessel or as often in dedication to, where you offer ritual dedication libations. So what we see here again is another playful thing. If we can imagine this bowl is full of wine, and as you're drinking, you're revealing this figure. They have these little cups now like that with like maybe a little cat in the bottom as you drink your coffee. There's a little sculptural cat. This is sort of what's going on here as well. However, the figure in the center is again a mythological figure. And this is the Queen Omphale. the Lydian queen Omphale, who was a lover of Hercules. And so we can see here that we have Omphale lying asleep after having a bit to drink. Both Hercules was known to be a follower of Bacchus, somebody who um, enjoyed spirit wine, and so you can see the wine cup, the skiffoi, overturned here, and she's all curled up asleep on 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 Hercules's lion skin with his club beneath, using his club as a pillow. Now, why this is clever, sort of from a mythological standpoint, because Omphale and Hercules get into kind of a silly situation due to wine drinking in one story, but also because Omphalos is the navel, the center of something. And so there's wordplay happening here where the queen Omphale is sitting in the center, the Omphalos of this vessel, and you would be revealing it as you drank. And also, she's sort of a cautionary tale because as you drink and you see Omphale, kind of a little worse for wear after having too much to drink, it's sort of like a warning to you, or maybe something that's meant to be sort of a playful warning that you too might find yourself flat out if you're not careful. So these are the sort of things that that's the way these objects could have worked in their social setting, and these are probably heirlooms. So these pieces date to the first century CE. I believe that um, they probably didn't find their way to Berthouville or were dedicated at Berthouville until the second or third century, which means these probably were handed down within a family. And when a Roman family came perhaps to Gaul, they brought them with them and then they dedicated them at this shrine. We can never know for sure, but that's one way this stuff could have ended up there. Now, the other thing that I wanted to touch on is conservation. So, one of the reasons that this material came to the US was that the Getty spent almost 4 years conserving this material. And why did they need to conserve it? Well, in part, silver tarnishes and can become damaged over, the surfaces can become degraded over time. But also, Prosper himself, as I mentioned, had used a sharp pickaxe and hoe to essentially excavate the material, which left some holes in pieces. The other thing is that when this material came out of the ground in 1830, it was typical to overclean things. So to really like Brillo pad, sort of take it down to the net. That's not how we conserve things anymore. So the conservators were faced with a whole bunch of different issues that they wanted to respond to. But one thing that they did, this is a statuette of Mercury. And what you see here, you can see the silver pieces, and then you can see all the sort of brownish material. This is wax. Again, wax was a very typical sort of material used for conservation, and in some cases it still is, but not really so much. So the conservators had the opportunity. They said they could have dismantled this, removed all the old wax, and then tried to reassemble it using some more modern techniques. But this is now a stable object, and it would put it in more danger essentially to remove the old um, conservation, pardon me. So what we see here is a 19th century wax support with the ancient pieces affixed to it. Now, here's another example of the type of conservation that can happen. So you can see that over time we have a lot of tarnish to the surface, and here we have sort of the before and after on one piece. Again, this is another offering bowl which was dedicated at the sanctuary. We have Mercury here with his little wings on his head, and then again we have Maya or Rosmerta. We don't know who. Maybe it was meant to be sort of a composite deity. We don't know, but we see here sort of the effect of contemporary cleaning on the piece. Another thing that happened when the material went to Malibu is that more scientific, more imaging, more scientific exploration happened on the pieces. So, for example, This is another of the centaur cups, which also is incredible. Again, we have a female centaur sort of dancing, and what you can't see here is that she's holding a tambourine that's reflective, and in the surface of that is rendered this scene of this Cupid knocking over another vessel with a panther coming out of it, and it's reversed because it's a mirror. So there's all these incredibly wonderful details and play that's happening here, both visual and intellectual. But the other thing that's interesting is that although it's beneath here and not visible to the eye, and also very faint, so they had to use different techniques in order to find this. There's an inscription. This inscription actually has the weight of the silver that was used to make the inner liner of this piece. So this says something to us about workshop practices. It's likely that different people made the different elements and then they were assembled. And if you were given X amount of silver, they didn't want you sort of skimming some of the silver off and doing something else with it. So you had to make sure that the amount of silver you were given was the amount of silver that ended up in the piece that you created. And this is a very exciting discovery. So again, even though there's a lot of things that we don't know, there are these little hints that can kind of suggest something about about how this material worked. So I'm just going to touch on one more object and then I'll open it up for questions. This object did not come from Berthouville. So this piece, though, was part. I wanted to show you this piece because it's beautiful, and B, because I think that it shows something of the very long life of objects and how they have ancient lives, modern lives, and they continue on and on. What we're looking at here principally is an ancient cameo. This probably dates between 41 to 45 CE. It is a large cameo. It's about this big. So the piece itself with the mount is quite big. Now, this cameo represents the god Jupiter. And we can see he has his staff, his lightning bolt, and his eagle, which is Jupiter's familiar. What's spectacular about this is a piece of sardonyx, and sardonyx is a banded stone. And in order to create an image, you carve it back to different degrees in order to sort of reveal a figure, essentially. It's very fine work and very easy to mess up. What's wonderful about this piece is not only the extremely sensitive musculature that we see on this figure, but also the artist has been able in a hard stone to render something of the gauziness of the fabric. And we can see Jupiter's legs sort of pushing into the fabric itself. This is outstanding. This is probably an imperial cameo, which means it was made in the emperor's workshop. The reason that we believe this is that there's another one very similar in style that we know came from an imperial workshop. So first we have this. Now, this cameos of this size oftentimes never went in the ground. They continued to be handed down from royal family to royal family across time. So it's believed that this cameo never went into the ground. We find it in the collection of Charles V, the French king, who reigned from 1338 to 1380. It's his collection, which is the heart of the Cabinet Médaille. Now, what this is, though, is so he had this cameo in his personal collection, and he decided to dedicate it at the Cathedral of Chartres. The reason that he did this was all four of his heirs had died, and he went on a pilgrimage to Chartres to ask for an heir. So what we see on this incredible mount that he had made for the piece is, it's down here, it says, Charles, King of France, dedicated, da 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 da. So we have this object being dedicated and given to the treasury at Chartres. Now, what happens during the French Revolution is that the cathedral treasuries are taken by the state, and many of these pieces were destroyed or were disassembled. However, at this time, the curator who was in charge at the Cabinet Médaille knew that this object would be vulnerable, and so acquired it again for the Cabinet Médaille. So that means that in the 1300s, this piece left the Cabinet Médaille and at sat at Chartres as a dedication until the late 1700s, when it returns back to that original collection. What's more is that we also have here on the back biblical verses. One of them is John the evangelist, and that is because Jupiter was associated with John the evangelist, because John the evangelist's little creature was the eagle and Jupiter's was the eagle. So we also have this wonderful story of taking a pagan object and sort of recasting it as a Christian object and then making it a dedication. So again, I could talk, as you can well tell, I could talk forever about this, but I see that there are some questions in the chat, and I want to give enough time for questions. So please, happy to answer questions, and thank you so much for your time and looking at this material with me.